Admitting a few more people here. Great. So well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our Zoom call on how legislatures are getting back to work. We know it's a really busy time, and we really appreciate you taking the time to participate today. I'm Erica McKellar, and I'm with the Fiscal Affairs Program at NCSL, and I'm also the liaison to the National Association of Legislative Fiscal Offices, or NALFO, one of NCSL's professional staff associations, and the group sponsoring today's webinar. While NALFO is sponsoring today's webinar, it's great to see so many people participating from NCSL's other staff associations and from such a wide variety of offices and states. I want to note that this is a public webinar and the session will be recorded and posted on our website. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to quickly type your state and office into the chat box just so we can get a sense of who is on the call today. And myself and my colleague, Emily Mayer, will be helping to monitor that chat box for our speakers today. So please feel free to put any questions you might have in there, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions, or share information about what's happening in your states. That's always really helpful for us to learn from you as well. Lastly, if you have any technical difficulties, please message me or Emily directly, and we will put our email addresses into that chat box so you have those handy. So as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has created many logistical challenges for state legislatures. And as legislatures across the country are getting ready to convene either in person or remotely, we wanted to provide an opportunity for legislative staff to get together and hear some of the changes that legislatures and offices are making in advance of those sessions, and also provide an opportunity for you to share your experiences. Our first speaker today is Natalie Wood. Natalie is the director of NCSL's Center for Legislative Strengthening. She provides expertise and leads research on legislative institutional issues, including internal legislative operations, management, and human resource policies, legislative workplace culture, and critical issues impacting representative democracy in the states. During her years with NCSL, Natalie has held key roles working on ethics and lobbying policy, legislative management and organization, and leadership staffing. Natalie has also been the liaison to two NCSL professional staff associations, the American Society of Legislative Clerks and Secretaries, and the Leadership Staff Professional Association. Our second speaker today is Jennifer Stewart with NCSL's Legislative Services Program. Prior to NCSL, Jen worked in municipal government here in Colorado, and she holds a master's degree in politics and public policy from the University of Colorado at Denver. And with that, I will ask Emily to please share our presenter's slides, and I will hand it over to Natalie.
And actually, Emily, you don't need to show mine just yet, but I'd rather, see any faces that are up on my screen. I see a couple brave souls who have undone their camera, so I can at least get a little bit of audience reaction. So thanks for that. As Erica said, I'm Natalie Wood. I direct the Center for Legislative Strengthening at NCSL, and it's great to see so many interested names and faces on the call, including people I haven't got to see in a long time in real life. So thanks for being here today with us to talk about this issue. Recently, I was giving a presentation before a group of policymakers, and before I spoke, the chair asked the members if they could create a list of quote unquote taboo words for the committee's future work sessions, just something fun and lighthearted to get the group going. And right away, they started coming up with terms like unprecedented, new normal, and pivot. Unfortunately for me, the great speaker, those words had totally seeped into my talking points, which makes sense because they are words that everybody is using to describe 2020. Luckily, in the moment, I was able to come up with some different words to talk about legislative operations over the past year. And perhaps surprisingly, none of them were four-letter ones. Just kidding. Since I have the floor, I thought I would take the opportunity to get a little audience interaction going. And I would like you to describe in a word or two what life has been like in your legislature in 2020. If you could just drop it in the chat and tell us whatever comes to mind. And I'm going to do my best to not use unprecedented, pivot, or new normal in my presentation today. Thanks. Those are powerful words, Ron. Quicksand, love it. I've used that one too. John, discombobulated. Thanks. Keep dropping them in there, and I'll get a chance to look at them when Jen is speaking, because I'm curious about what everybody has to say. My words for today are remarkable, flexible, and innovative. The staff on this call and others who've contributed to making sessions run smoothly in the past year have really achieved remarkable things over the past year using flexibility and innovation in the process. And since we're just coming off of Thanksgiving, a time to give gratitude, I wanted to start my remarks with that today, and reflecting over the kinds of changes we've seen in legislatures. As a student of legislatures, I can really say this has been a time of remarkable change and transition. So I wanted to start with that. My job today is to talk to you about some of these remarkable ways that legislatures have handled aspects of legislative operations. And I'm going to do a little bit of information sharing and, to be honest, predicting about what 2021 is going to look like. My team in the Center for Legislative Strengthening has been tracking session activity, including remote participation and committee work, among other legislative processes. And Jen's going to cover a little bit more of the Capitol building and operational side of things. There are 99 ways to run a legislative chamber in ordinary times, and the same has been true over the course of the pandemic. Constitutional provisions, chamber rules, statutes, court opinions, all of these have influenced legislative decision-making. This should probably come as no surprise to the folks on this call today. But then you throw in technological capability, the session, the size of legislative bodies, legislative leadership, and even weather concerns for those that met outside this year, you name it, and logistics have impacted the approach as well. So when we think about 2021, before I tell you a little bit about what some legislatures have talked about doing or what they've decided to do, I thought it would be worthwhile to reflect back on the past year, because legislatures rely on precedent and tradition, and 2020 gave us plenty of that, if nothing else. It's very possible that some of the same strategies that legislatures used in the previous months will be used in the coming year. 23, all legislatures except 4 were scheduled to meet in 2020. 4 states are still biennial. So those states did not have regular session on the agenda, but even still, one of them, Nevada, met in special session, and 22 other legislatures and some territories have had special sessions in 2020 as well. And then interim hearings and meetings also took place in the summer and the fall. And this is all built up to allow legislatures some experience in operating throughout the course of the pandemic. One of the biggest stories with respect to operations has been remote participation. And when I use that term, I'm talking about a variety of different things, including voting on the floor, voting in committee, participating on the part of the members and the public in committee proceedings. And also remote participation, the way we've tracked it anyway, has meant using proxy voting on the floor, which has been the case in 10 chambers, and then more virtual tools like Zoom, like Teams, like WebEx, even conference call in a couple of places. Since March, in at least 27 states, the District of Columbia, Guam, and the Virgin Islands, one chamber or both has adopted rules to allow for this. In most cases, and Emily, I have slides on to this effect, and I don't know if I triggered you to show them, but my first slide is a graphic of the special sessions that were held. So you can kind of see if you are one of those fortunate states that had a special session, and I don't know if there's Minnesota folks on this call, but I think you guys have had maybe more than anybody this year. You can see who else has been in this position. Colorado just adjourned after a 3-day special session last week. And then the next slide, Emily, apologize for not thinking to tell you to show the slide. The next slide is a map that shows, actually the title is a little misleading. It's actually legislatures that have adopted the ability to allow members to participate remotely over the past year. And then we also have seen remote participation take place in committee as well. And the color coding can kind of show you if it's both chambers or just one. So back to what I was saying, the remote participation strategy has been used in over half of the states and some territories, but in most cases, nearly all, the rule change has been time bound, only put in place for the current legislature or tied to an emergency or this emergency specifically. So we expect that all these states might not necessarily be states that adopt remote participation next year, though it's certainly a possibility given that they were able to do so this year. And there hasn't been one uniform way that chambers have conducted their proceedings using remote participation. It can mean a variety of things. In addition to proxy voting, there are some legislatures that, or some chambers rather, that have used it, a virtual tool like Zoom for the whole body to participate remotely. Vermont, in the House and Senate, that's one example. In other cases, that remote capability was applied in a select way. You know, if a legislator made the case to leadership, for example, that he or she needed to participate remotely, they were given the permission and authority to do so. But it's really varied as far as, you know, hybrid approach is what some people call it. Some people have been in the chamber or in the legislative building in their offices participating in session. Others have been on Zoom. It's really varied depending on the legislative body. So as I said, meeting and voting completely using virtual platforms, one example, using proxy votes, allowing the members to be physically present somewhere in the building while others participate virtually, and offering live webcasts or television broadcasts of legislative floor proceedings, which is available in all 50 state legislatures. Many legislatures are archiving proceedings as well. We're before the pandemic, but more are doing it now. In other states, besides the ones on that map, and in addition to some of the ones on that map, chamber rules or statutes have authorized remote committee meetings as well. We've gathered information from at least, I would say, around 35 or more states where one chamber or both has held committee proceedings with some remote aspects in 2020. And common strategies that we've seen be used for public participation, which is a big question that we're getting asked a lot of at NCSL. Common strategies have included providing live testimony via video or telephone during the virtual hearing, requiring individuals who wish to testify remotely to sign up in advance via an electronic sign-in sheets. This helps with the prep work needed, and in addition to many other things, to get the committee meeting going. Having the public submit comments through an online comment or testimony submission form. Massachusetts did this, for example, and even in that state, some committee chairs allowed video recorded testimony as well. Asking folks to email comments and testimony to published committee or individual legislator email addresses is another strategy. And then even in Oregon's case, establishing a kiosk outside of the Capitol building during the interim so that the public could come and participate in committee proceedings, which is an interesting strategy, I think. Holding virtual public listening sessions prior to session or during session. Nebraska and Vermont did this. And then again, broadcasting the hearing through live stream, webcasting, or other methods. Turning our attention to 2021, I can't say with certainty how every single legislative chamber is going to function in the coming year. Unlike last year, all legislatures are scheduled to meet in 2021. Those biennial states will convene, and they, in fact, are among the group that have announced some plans already in a couple of cases. Some legislatures used or have been using standing, select, or interim legislative committees in order to collect information, get expertise, and weigh options. In other legislatures, it's been more, among discussions among leadership, which of course we had to wait until the election in many cases and still do to find out who those leaders will be. But Indiana, Montana, Nevada, North Dakota, South Dakota, Washington, and Wyoming are all examples where a committee process has helped guide some of the decision making. In addition, there are many full-time legislatures, such as Massachusetts, Michigan, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, that regularly met throughout the pandemic. Didn't take much of a break at all in session when things started to hit in March. And I've heard from staff in at least two of those states, Massachusetts and Michigan, that 2021 will likely look the same in the foreseeable future. In Massachusetts' case, it's more been a virtual approach to session, with the Capitol being more close to the public. In Michigan, the legislature has been meeting in person. So some legislatures have announced plans, and aspects of that will need to be adopted once formal session begins. Both chambers in Indiana, Maryland, North Dakota, Washington, Wyoming, and the Virginia House have publicized plans about how they're going to approach the 2021 session. And it shouldn't surprise you that none of them will be operating in an identical way. And this could even be between chambers. In Maryland, for example, the House and Senate are adopting similar approaches, but different because of the size of the body. Indiana and Maryland, the sessions will be held in person, and Jen's going to talk a little bit more about what Maryland has said that they are going to do. In Washington and in the Virginia House, the session will have a strong virtual component. Wyoming it has opted to convene for opening day in person, but formally delay the start of session until a later date. We see right now legislatures are actually holding organizational sessions, like Florida had one already, as did Indiana. California is meeting today, and so I'm anxious to see how things shook out during their organizational session. They were meeting in person, but their actual regular session starts today too. In Montana, the Rules Committee, which I was watching right before this call, is meeting for 4 hours today and tomorrow as well to discuss their 2021 rules. So I just give you a lot of information without taking a breath, but if you have questions for me, you're going to need to hold them for just a bit longer because I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jen Stewart, for more feedback and information.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Stewart. I am with the Legislative Staff Services Program here at NCSL, and I will be talking about COVID-19 health and safety protocols. And I've been working with NCSL to track these issues as we've gone through 2020. So here we go. Next slide. So we realize that states have been grappling with the issue of health and safety protocols throughout 2020 and going forward into 2021 throughout the pandemic. And so the main topics that I'll be discussing today are the health and safety protocol survey results that we received, and I'll explain more in the next slide and going forward. And then we'll share some examples of plans that have been put in place for 2020 and expected plans for 2021, and briefly discuss some examples of offsite meetings and briefly discuss public access to capitals during this time. So next slide. So to begin, NCSL initiated a survey to gain insight on what current and or planned safety protocols were for legislatures. And so in 2020, we deployed this survey to all of the states. And of course, as we all know, going through 2020 and 2021 in the years going forward, all of this information is just a small snapshot in time of where we stand today and where we stood at the time of the survey. And it's preliminary and subject to change, just like everything else in our lives these days. So this survey covered about 6 different topics. And so I'll briefly discuss each of those topics that are most pertinent to this discussion today. And we asked about public health expert, medical consultant advice, who everybody's working with and who they're partnering with. And then obviously personal protective equipment, we asked about that, safety partitions, social distancing requirements and protocols, health screenings in COVID-19, testing requirements or recommendations, and then cleaning and sanitation protocols, things like hand sanitizer and things like that. So far we received 26 responses from 23 states and legislative chambers, and this includes the DC, Virgin Islands, and Guam. So next slide. So starting off, so in terms of public health advice, we asked in the survey who states were consulting with to help guide them through putting protocols into place to meet safely for themselves and for the public and pretty much everyone to meet safely as possible. So some examples of who is being consulted with are the state's Department of Health, the public health officials in the states. Some reported meeting with public safety officials and governor's offices. And so there's more information on this slide, but just for instance, Alaska met with their chief medical officer and chief epidemiologist. And one thing worth noting was that Colorado's Department of Public Health and Environment, so CDPHE, provided guidance to the legislature before their November special session last Monday. And so the intent of this guidance was to help the House and the Senate decide what protocols should be in place for when they met. And this covered health screenings, testing, contact tracing if there was a positive test, and the ability to provide N95 masks. And the state's Emergency Operations Center was able to provide these masks if it was requested. And so you'll just see there's, I've just highlighted a few different ways that legislatures have worked with the states and their experts to gain guidance on what to do. So next slide. Oh, and I failed to mention in the beginning, if you all wouldn't mind sharing what you all are planning to do. I only have a few different states examples here, but it's helpful for everybody if you can share what you're considering or what protocols you've had or plan to have in 2021, or so that would be helpful as well. Sorry. So now, so for this slide, we are covering PPE and face masks and face coverings. And so for the first few bullets, I've outlined the Florida House and Senate, the Maryland House and Senate, and North Dakota. And these are not part of the survey results. This is just what we've found over the past couple of months and going forward in 2021. So just for instance, you'll see that the Florida House and Senate, these mask protocols or recommendations will just cover 2020 organizational sessions that just happened in November. And you'll see I've noted in the House, the 2021 session protocols will be released at the end of February of next year. So, and for the Florida House, the masks were required for guests. And then for Maryland House and Senate, you'll see that they're both, so going to their regular session in 2021, they will be requiring face coverings. And in the House, the Anne Arundel County Health Department can have members fitted for N95 masks if they would like to purchase them. And North Dakota is requiring, required masks during 2020 organizational session, and just recently updated, they will be requiring masks for 2021. And so in terms of access to PPE, so we asked this question in our survey, and our findings found that every chamber reported providing face masks primarily in various ways. And so the majority of these offerings were legislators and staff if they needed them. And then also some states reported offering masks to registered lobbyists, members of the public, and the credentialed press. And a couple reported offering face shields and gloves if they were requested. And let me make sure I got everything. And so another thing of noting, Wyoming's draft and proposed safety protocols do include face coverings required for next year. So next slide, please. And social distancing, I'll just be brief on this. As we go through our lives in 2020, I think we're all aware of when we go to Target, we have to stand 6 feet apart from each other, and only a certain amount of people allowed in a business at a certain time. And so there's, you'll see on this slide, it's pretty much everything that we're dealing with and having to and be aware of in our personal lives. So really the biggest thing that I wanted to point out here on this social distancing list is that many members of the public especially are used to their capitals being the house of the people. So being able to casually walk in is not so much the case anymore in 2020 and 2021. So scheduling of appointments in advance and being escorted throughout the buildings are things that we heard, are things that were reported in the survey findings. Okay, next slide, please. And so we also asked about health screenings. And so you'll see here, to gain entrance to some of the buildings, the Capitol buildings, states reported having to, or requiring temperature checks and or COVID-19 screening questions prior to entering. And so you'll see that that outside groups, the police, sergeant at arms and building units are and also self-administered tests are the people are who's screening. And so also just a brief thing to note is that some states are using health screening apps. And so what I mean by that is Maryland's House and Senate, you go on an app on your phone, answer COVID-19 screening questions prior to entering the building for that day. And so they'll have that in place in 2021. And so I've noted Michigan uses Microsoft Forms and Washington reported considering My MedBot. So, let's see. And then, so examples of COVID-19 testing. I just put some states here. So Alaska reported considering using a third party or contracting with a third party to for testing and screening protocols. COVID tests will be required prior to 2021 legislative session. So Colorado, as I mentioned earlier, met last week, and CDPHE, the health department, provided rapid testing each morning of the special session, and also were required to report back with a negative COVID test. And so for Florida, they had rapid testing available on site for their organizational sessions, and the Senate had on-site rapid testing the Sunday, Monday leading up to Tuesday's organizational session in November. Maryland also reported having testing on site, and Wyoming also, with their draft protocols, is planned to require COVID-19 testing for most staff and legislators. So next slide, please. Okay, so then we asked about sanitizing and cleaning protocols, and you'll see that the majority of states that reported having sanitizing protocols in, pretty much all aspects of Capitol buildings, and some buildings remain closed and some spaces are sanitized only when used or necessary. And some are sanitized daily or after every use. It's really up to the legislature, but generally speaking, daily sanitizing and as much as necessary. And every state reported having readily available hand sanitizer throughout the building and throughout different spaces. So next slide, please. So that ends the portion of the survey findings that we got through our October health and safety protocol survey. So now I'll discuss briefly different plans that we've seen. So like I mentioned, Florida held House and Senate organizational sessions. And actually you'll see on this slide, there's a focus on increased HVAC and airflow protocols and air purifiers that are being installed or placed in different areas of the capitals while meeting. And so you'll see Florida and Maryland have both put an emphasis on this key, this key area. Also limiting, so Florida, you'll see limiting organizational sessions to just one guest allowed, typically a spouse or a guest, and travel restrictions for different staff. And so, and then another thing worth noting is Maryland for 2021 legislative sessions plans, they've put contact teams in place. And so if there is a positive COVID-19 test result, they're able to act swiftly to do contact tracing. So let's see, so that's kind of the summary. So next slide, please. And then, so just briefly, here are some examples. You'll see different states and how they've met throughout the year or planned to meet to enact social distancing guidelines with more space. You'll see, so there's just a running list there. And currently, as we stand today, from our data, it shows that 21 capitals are open to the public and 30 capitals are closed to the public. Next slide. So that is all I have. This is a very, very high level overview of what we've found. And so I have my contact information there. If you have questions or would like more information, or really anything after this call that we didn't get to go through, I am more than happy to answer any questions and work with you as we need. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Natalie and Jen. We really appreciate your expertise here. Starting to get some questions in the chat box. If you have a question, feel free to drop it in there and we're happy to ask it of our presenters, or if you prefer to be brave and unmute, feel free to do that as well.
I can take the one, Erica, I see the one about New Hampshire, and I can, I think Rhonda asked that question, and I can, they did meet in a hot hearing, John, you're right. Good job with your trivia. But for the organizational session that they just held, they actually met in a different sports venue. I believe it was the University of New Hampshire's football field. It was outside. And they did their swearing in there, though not all members attended. Some had the option to be sworn in virtually. And I read conflicting reports about whether that meant via phone with the governor or via a video conference call of some sort. But that is what the New Hampshire House did. The Senate, I believe, met in, well, I hope I'm not confused. I think they met in the chambers. I think Maine met in a building where the House and Senate were in two different places. So that's what New Hampshire chose to do. But I do not believe they've made decisions about how they'll proceed necessarily for the regular session. But if someone from New Hampshire's on the call, I always learn the most when we have learning opportunities like this one. So feel free to weigh in if you're from New Hampshire.
Anyone want to jump in on that? Thanks, Natalie. It sounds like legislatures are definitely getting a little creative with how they're meeting. Jen, I think this next question is for you. What protocols do legislatures meeting in person have in place in the event someone tests positive during session?
So I would say that it varies, as we all know. However, what I've found through research and responding and respondents and news articles is the importance of those tests and those those COVID tests and the negative results before the sessions. And so some states reported if there was a positive test being sent home right away, if symptoms were reported or there was an elevated temperature during a temperature check, they were sent home right away. So, and then really keeping the only the essential staff and limiting guests and things of that nature were of high importance in terms of having to handle positive tests.
I can jump into, I know like Washington is one. So Washington was a legislature that had adjourned sine die for the year in early March. So wasn't meeting in regular session like other legislatures were throughout the full course of the pandemic. And so some of the information I shared earlier doesn't reflect what happened in that state because they weren't meeting. Washington has announced plans on the Senate more definitively than the House based on what I've read and the folks that I've talked to there. And the Senate has a plan that heavily involves the Human Resources Office. So if there's a positive test, their plan sort of describes the process that will be followed. And I think that's online, something that I can even try to find it and have it as a resource for Erica and Emily after the call is over. But it sort of details with more specificity what the process is and who they notify and when, and how they determine with whom that person had contact, et cetera. And if you're from Washington, please feel free to weigh in and add information.
Anyone from Washington feel like participating?
Oh, hi, Sarah. Hey.
Natalie got it really, she got it covered really well. We have one large document that we use and that we've given out to all of our offices that kind of, sorts out the protocol for the session. And as she indicated, it's more hybrid. We want everybody to be working from home unless they have to be in the office. And then each of those offices have to be vetted through our human resource officer. So they have to have a staff plan and how they will work in their office. And that is only for permanent staff. All of our session staff will be remote. So.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for chiming in. And oh, Sarah, okay, great. For some reason in the view that I'm in, I couldn't see who was talking for a minute. So thank you, Sarah. Appreciate you jumping in. Just a logistical question, Natalie and Jen. For these plans that we're discussing, are you tracking them on NCSL's website? Or are they downloadable, the ones that are out there?
Good question, Erica. When it comes to what we're paying attention to, so we have some information and resources available on our website, but we also have been tracking on more of the information with respect to committee work and the different ways that committees are working. We have an internal document that we've been using. We're happy to share it. And we'll probably create something very similar for 2021. I do not have something that's ready to be sent out yet, mostly because I am compiling information from a variety of sources, including listserv questions where we've gotten some responses, news articles, and then plans that are being published on legislative websites. As I mentioned, I was geeking out watching Montana's hearing earlier today. So some of my research work has been just going on to committee websites and trying to see what motions, resolutions, et cetera, are being adopted or being considered, I should say. We also have a tracking, like if the legislature is introducing a resolution related to operations, we have tracked that in 2020, whether it's introduced or whether it was actually adopted by the body, and we'll do that for 2021 as well. So once things start to become more firm, yes, we will have something available, but because we need to wait for sessions to actually start in many cases, that will probably have to wait. We also are tracking news articles on the website too, and we can share those with you guys, Erica and Emily after the fact. Jen, you go next.
I would just echo what Natalie said. Things change so quickly, so we'll just keep researching and have more available as it comes.
And especially on the committee processes, those of you who staff committees or who work with committee chairs, that's been interesting to analyze and track what's going on, because in some legislatures, the chair has a lot of discretion about how a committee proceeding is going to work. In one legislative chamber, I watched a hearing get sort of public participation be solicited in 3 different ways. As an example, all of which are permissible under the body's rules, but it just looks different kind of depending on the preferences of the chair and what that legislature has adopted overall.
Thank you. Natalie, I have a question for you. You know, you kind of talked about remote participation for members, but can you talk a little bit more about how staff are working remotely?
Oh, sure, Erica, happy to. I bet that's a question near and dear to everyone's heart on the call. And it's varied. We don't have a comprehensive list of every legislative office in the country and how and where they're working at the moment. We did a call with human resources directors and staff and legislative directors in August on the topic of returning to work. That too is a resource we're happy to give to Erica and Emily. I don't know if you're developing a whole page for this, but we can put that on there, where we had the COO from SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management. He talked about strategies for going back to a physical work location. Now, that was August, and things look a lot different now with respect to what's happening with the virus. And so priorities and plans have changed or may have changed. At that time, about a third of our audience, and there were probably about, I don't know, 60 I'm sorry, there were probably about 80 staff on the call from about 35 states, I think, and about a third of them reported they were working remotely. A third were back in the Capitol or their office buildings, and then a third, it was a mix. So it's varied throughout the course of the pandemic. Like Washington shared, some legislatures are having most staff work remotely. I know that's the case in Massachusetts as well, unless your specific job function requires you to be in the Capitol building or doing your work that way. New Jersey, they were remote. They came back and did like a staggered plan where half the staff in their nonpartisan staffing agency went back in one group, and then another day the other group went, and then I believe they're back to remote work. I think I saw maybe there was a New Jersey attendee or two who can fact check me on that. But we did publish an article about telework strategies, and that article highlights approaches used in Oregon, in Washington. This is Washington's day to shine, I guess, Sarah. We keep referencing you guys. So Utah is in there too. And that article talks about some strategies that legislatures developed. Some of those legislatures had telework. Thanks, Ingrid. I see. Great. New Jersey back to remote work. Strategies that legislatures can use, empowering managers to make decisions if that's a possibility about who can work from home and who can't. In Utah, the auditors were interviewed for that. Thank you, Emily. And they talked about the nature of their work actually is not very conducive to remote work. And so the person that my colleague Selena interviewed for that talked about some strategies that they were using. So that's a resource if people are curious. And feel free to weigh in if, I see there's a couple of comments in the chat that I can't look at, but if anybody has experience with remote work they want to share. But I do know some staff are back in state capitol buildings.
Yeah, does anybody want to share their experience before we move on? Okay. Another question in the chat here revolves around members of the press. And I don't know if you guys have seen any policies around that yet. Are states implementing caps on how many reporters they can have? Are they requiring testing of reporters? Are they even allowed access to Capitol and chambers at this point? Any policies you've seen around that?
I mean, like, Jen, do you have any? I know that the press has been allowed into Capitol buildings, but I know you're tracking that a little more closely than me, so I'll let you go.
So I just recently started working on this within the week, this exact question or very similar question. So some states have reported because their Capitol is closed, there is no floor for press. Let's see here. Actually, can I read through this and then I'll get, maybe we can move on and then come back. So, because I just started, so I do have information. I just want to make sure I'm reporting it accurately.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
doing that. Let's see. So Natalie, I don't know if this is a question that you can answer, but are there states that are allowing public comments for a period of time after a committee hearing? And if so, what is that period of time and how are committee findings handled?
That is a good question. I'm thinking about that one. As I mentioned, I'm assuming that the question is regarding remote participation. And I kind of laid out a bunch of the different strategies that legislatures were using. I can't recall if submitting testimony after the session or the committee proceeding has occurred. Something, I haven't seen it frequently, but I can double check. I'm looking to see who asked that question. Happy to respond to you directly after the call with some follow-up on that. I can't recall if I've seen a specific instance of that, but that doesn't mean it's not happening.
Right.
Please wait if anyone has an insight there.
Yes, Sarah just put in the chat that in Washington, they're allowing credentialed press into the galleries, but limiting it to 6. I'm just trying to look here for additional questions. A lot of stuff in the chat box.
I'm seeing the question about secretaries working remotely.
Yes.
I think again, I had seen Washington's plan pretty recently where it talked about legislative aides, not the same necessarily as a secretary, but I know many legislatures use legislative aides. And I think in some of them where the body is back to meeting in person, my assumption is that the aides are doing the same, but I'm not sure completely and totally of what's happening in each and every state, but we can get back to you. Unless anyone has something to share on that one.
I can jump in. In our office, so we're in the Secretary's office in Washington, and all of our staff are remote. And we actually have just applications on our computers where our staff are answering the phones directly. So it doesn't transfer, it just goes straight to their desk phone at home. And we have not had anyone working in the back in our offices consistently since March. So we have figured out a way that works really well. We have like 3 people answering the phone, during the day, and yeah, it works.
Interesting.
I believe the Massachusetts Senate is similarly their staff that work for the members, although they're in district offices. So it's depending. Some have state house offices, some have district offices. So it will depend. And I see Illinois jumped in. Great.
Jen, did you have a chance to look through that information?
Yes. So what I've found is that in terms of caps on credentialed press, so you normally, so one state reported that there's only 1 reporter allowed in the chamber. Normally there's a couple or a few that are allowed. So putting kind of limits in terms of that. So, and then one state reported accommodating reporter reviews virtually because they are all virtual. And let's see, what else here? And then in terms of press and reporters with testing, I don't have anything specific on that, but one state reported allowing media inside the Capitol, but only with temperature checks, and they have to wear masks. And so let's see here. I think that's the highlights of what I've been able to gather so far, and I can obviously follow up with more after our call too, in the interest of time.
Excellent. Thanks for looking through that. I know there was a question about providing closed captioning, and I believe we can definitely speak about this issue a little bit now if you want, but I believe NCSL does have some other data on this as well. Natalie or Jen, do you know if that's the case and that we can send along after this call?
Actually, yes, we were conversing offline, so to speak, about that question, and we'll follow up directly with the requester. So we're on it.
Great.
Don't have an answer at this very moment.
And then Jen, I had a question for you. The states that are starting to use these health tracker apps, are they required of legislators or are they voluntary? Cool.
I don't want to misspeak, so I can follow up, and I'm just like most things, I think it probably varies. I did see that somebody in the chat, as I was speaking, I saw that somebody asked a question about what app Maryland is using, and I wanted to note that in my findings, I found that they developed this app in-house, and so it's something that internally they've put together. But I can gather more information if needed.
Interesting. Great. Other questions for our speakers today? Or does anyone want to chime in with policies we haven't talked about that your legislatures might be developing? No? Well, then I guess Natalie or Jen, any kind of parting thoughts or words of wisdom for us here as folks plan to get back to work?
I'm just grateful for the opportunity to be with a group of staff virtually. It's, you know, the silver lining of this year has been the ability to convene and connect with you all more frequently. Sitting in this chair with my kids outside of my door, remote learning. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here, and feel free to contact me. I didn't provide my information in my slides as paltry as they were, but I'll put it here in the chat for anybody that needs it.
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you. And of course, any follow-up questions or more information or clarity or anything of that nature, I am happy to help and share more than I did this afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you both so much. We really appreciate it. This brings us to the conclusion of our time together. Just a reminder that this webinar is recorded and will be available on our website along with some of the other resources that Natalie and Jen mentioned. If you have follow-up questions or need any information, please feel free to reach out to any of us here at NCSL, and we are happy to assist you in any way that we can. With that, I'd just like to thank you all for participating this afternoon. And thank you so much, Natalie and Jen, for your expertise and great information.
Thank you.
Thank you.